Hi, I'm Andrew Hall, Sports Dietitian and Exercise Scientist. I work with the Brisbane Broncos and Brisbane Bullets sports teams and with a bunch of people in clinics to help them get the most out of their performance and health in general. And you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back, or welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by the Gold Coast Marathon and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports and exercise physiotherapist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. The aim of this show is to educate and inspire you towards the pursuit of your own physical best performance. We do this through interviews featuring some of the world's top physical performers and also some of the world's preeminent experts in their chosen fields. Each week we'll bring you episodes including interest editions, expert editions, featured performer editions, and coaches' corners. And on today's episode 155, I bring you a conversation with sports dietitian and exercise scientist Andrew Hall. Andrew Hall is the sports dietitian for the Brisbane Broncos Rugby League Club, the Brisbane Bullets Basketball Team. Andrew consults in clinic based out of Brisbane, does work with corporate workplace health, and he's also the Queensland Coordinator for Sports Dietetics Australia. And there has been a great request for the featuring of a sports dietitian really since early days of the podcast when we started to introduce expert editions. So I am so excited to share with you the knowledge of Andrew Hall on this expert edition. During the conversation, we cover performance nutrition concepts around endurance sports. Andrew touches on key concepts such as the availability of energy and why it matters, macronutrients, fat, carbohydrates, proteins, the timing of ingesting these nutrients, why food quality is so important, strategies for negotiating race day, strategies for recovery. Andrew busts some popular myths around nutrition and sports performance. And we finish the conversation exploring the role that nutrition can have on injury management, including recovery from being immobilised in a moon boot or a cast, recovery from concussion, bone stress injuries, and the rehabilitation of tendons. There is so much in this expert edition. You're going to want to have a pen and paper by your side. Here is my conversation, this expert edition with Andrew Hall, sports dietitian and exercise scientist. Andrew Hall, sports dietitian and exercise scientist. We've been working on getting this one recorded for some time, so it's fantastic to finally invite you and have you on to the Physical Performance Show.
Yes, thanks for having me, Brad. I'm glad we managed to find a time that worked for us both.
Andrew, your world is very full and it keeps getting fuller. Recently taking on Brisbane Broncos as their sports dietitian alongside the Brisbane Bullets Basketball Team. In clinic work, corporate health work, leading the Sports Dietitian Australia Queensland branch or coordinating PD efforts among sports dietitians in the state of Queensland. It's a very full world. I want to know what's one thing that Andrew Hall is learning at the moment.
I guess the ongoing interest I've got around tendon healing, chatting with physiotherapists and reading all the latest research coming out of a couple of labs here and in the UK, and just around what can be done from a nutrition point of view on helping individuals come back from those sort of tendinopathy or tendon issues. So that's a common interest and a thing I like to keep up to date with all, because it is a lot of research. They're trying to get through it at the moment.
And what are you learning? What can you share in terms of how nutrition can assist with tendinopathy or tendon pain healing? I know that, as a physiotherapist, I've seen green tea ingesting green tea and glycine thrown around, but what can you share in terms of how nutrition can affect tendon healing?
My personal interest came about from my own frustration with tendons. So to anyone out there who's got a tendon issue, it's I feel your pain. The strongest evidence is around what we can do before doing the rehab. So the physio would, I guess, put together that rehab program and that's going to have the most influence in managing load. But if we can use some nutrition before that, so I call it collagen priming, which basically means that a gelatin or a collagen supplement is consumed about an hour before the rehab exercise. They've sort of shown that the tendon is more likely to absorb those nutrients, and that might help with the rate of which that tendon heals. The reason you would use collagen or gelatin is that there are particular amino acids in that type of protein, and it happens an hour before because that's around the time they've sort of shown to get through to digestion and into that sort of space around the tendon. Now, Brad, you would know that tendons they absorb more for a short period of time, and then their absorption sort of starts to fade away. So the rehab that I've seen in the papers that I've read essentially is that you would have the collagen, an hour later you would do your rehab, and then there'd be a break in exercise, and then 6 hours later you would go through the same process. So that's pretty much where it is from a nutrition point of view. In
the clinical sense, Andrew, as a practicing sports dietitian, can you share any great case studies of where you've seen, the influence of nutrition potentially affect one of your athletes or patients or clients' outcomes?
Yeah, okay. I guess the other thing I probably need to mention there is to make sure that the total amount of energy coming in from the diet is there. If that's not there, then it's going to be very hard for the body to then go and heal injured structures. So we want to make sure that that part is correct, and then that the total diet itself is of high quality. Once we've ticked all those boxes, then we'd probably move into this more specific supplement protocol. Following on from before, there's also the need for vitamin C, because that particular vitamin is used in the building blocks, I guess, of that collagen structure. So if we're not having that at that time, or if we're deficient in that particular vitamin, then that whole process I mentioned before might not happen.
Is this common practice amongst sports dietitians, or is this just something that, as a sufferer of a tendinopathy in the past, you've really just taken a niche little interest to?
I would say it started off with me, my personal interest, and now it's becoming more common through. So most sports dietitians would know about it. It's been a research coming out over the last sort of 3 to 5 years, so it's becoming more and more popular now.
Yeah, no, interesting. And so specific protocol-wise, what sort of amount of vitamin C, gelatin/collagen supplements are needed?
Yeah, good question. So around 50 milligrams of vitamin C, and then they've sort of, the dynamics of which the amount of collagen and the peak, I guess, appearance in the bloodstream can change depending on how much. So they've sort of shown that the sweet spot is 50 milligrams of vitamin C and 15 grams of collagen or gelatin.
15 grams of collagen or gelatin. And how far before exercise did you say? And is it specifically tendon rehab exercise that you're ingesting this before?
So from an injury point of view, yes, but I would say that it is a useful, almost preventative tool. So there are those other structures with ligaments and joint cartilage that may benefit due to their similar structures, similar sort of nutrient absorption. They're obviously structures that don't have great blood flow. Myself and the team sports where, the budget is there, we would use that as a preventative, because they've got to get through a big season, a lot of stress on the body. There's a risk benefit, I guess, with any supplement, but there is more benefit than risk involved in this one when done correctly and using supplements that have been tested for banned substances, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. So there's the utility for actual rehabilitation, and there's also the utility to try and, I guess, maximise the resilience or the quality of the tissues to ward off injuries.
Absolutely. Yep.
Got it. So thank you for taking us through that interest area. And what's a day or a week like in your life as a sports dietitian, Andrew?
Well, it depends on the day. So I guess going through what I would do in a week is probably the easiest thing. I consult with the Brisbane Bullets, as you mentioned, so that would be working with the players, making sure that, they're feeling great, their energy levels are good, they're hitting their body composition targets, so they're, putting on muscle if they need to, or losing body fat if they need to. Similar sort of thing with the Brisbane Broncos, except there's probably a bit more, food service stuff. So thinking around when they're at training, we're providing them meals, so working with caterers to create interesting flavour-filled food that looks good to eat. So we're making sure that they're ticking those boxes on the day that they're in the training facility. I've also got to liaise with hotels and restaurants when they travel, just to make sure that we're getting those good quality nutrients in as much as possible. From a clinic perspective, I work with a range of individuals from, elite, sub-elite, down to weekend warriors and some people who might just, walk their dog in the morning. So it really is just around helping them get the most out of their health and their performance. And that's a really great part of the job, and I always love seeing those personal improvements with those people. And then the other thing that I do would be to go into workplaces and be their health person. So that might involve presentations, education sessions, and then those sort of one-on-one consultations as well.
Yeah, so it's a very full week. And what do you love about the teams aspect? Working on basketball and rugby league. What is it about the team environment that you enjoy?
Well, I guess growing up, I played basketball or team sports myself, so I guess I've always been sort of interested in that whole teamwork aspect, and working with a bunch of other health professionals to achieve goals, seeing those sort of development athletes or the improvements that a player can have through those nutritional changes, those education, those light bulb moments where something that seems quite normal to me isn't a knowledge for them and can have a big effect on the way that they're feeling or performing. And obviously just wanting to make them get through a whole season with the stresses, the physical stresses as well. In
terms of the weekend warrior, have you observed that there's a bit of an awakening I would say from my profession looking outwards, there seems to be a greater awareness of the importance of fueling for performance / through nutrition than ever before. What are your views on that?
Absolutely. When I first started on this journey, I don't think that the hype and the information sharing and the platforms that are available were. So there's lots of great things about it. There obviously are a couple of maybe not so great things about all that, but people taking an interest in their health and wanting to improve their sporting performance typically can only have good flow and effects for their health span later down the track as well. So I love it.
Yeah, no, fantastic. What's before we go into a couple of key topics, one being performance nutrition concepts and two being further injury management nutrition conversation. What are the misconceptions that people have around your work as a dietitian, or perhaps their own diet, that you're regularly correcting or that regularly bug you? Would there be top three myths that sort of stir up Andrew Hall?
A lot of people sort of use the phrases good and bad foods. So they'll come in and think that I'm going to, sort of be the food police and tell them, these are the good foods, you have to eat these are bad foods, don't eat these. But that very rarely works. And I think that for anything, any sort of behaviour change or improvements to be long lasting, they need to be realistic. So I think that, the words that people use around food, the thoughts, has a big impact on how they feel when they eat those foods. And I'm sure you can understand that, why and what people eat is a very, very complex thing. So I just guess normalising that and then just trying to work with that individual to make it a realistic outcome.
So that's a good one. And I think as a physiotherapist, I often reflect that in my 20s, I would almost say I was quite judgmental of people's compliance, patients of mine. Do you want to get it right or not? Come on, let's get on with it. And then as I moved into my 30s, I think I'm much more grace-based, and I like what you just said. For long-standing changes, they need to be realistic. And people's worlds are busy, correct? So, they're not necessarily in a professional sporting league. So they've got busy worlds. So it seems to be quite liberating for people to be given permission to just do their best.
Yeah, absolutely. Focusing on that progress. So I think that people might come in, chat in that first session, and then want to come back 2 weeks later and have everything working perfectly. But I think it's very important to realise that that's probably not a realistic approach. And if we just chip away and work on progress, or if we make a plan and it doesn't work, well, then let's dig deeper into that and figure out, what were some of the challenges. Maybe they were unexpected, and then there's plenty of different ways to skin a cat, as they say. So it's about working out the right equation for that individual. And there's a lot of, problem solving involved in my work, which is what I love because it's never the same.
Yeah, and so if people are still conceptualising their food choices around good and bad, can you just help us with our processing? What can you share to set us free, if you like?
Blanket cutting out of food groups typically, I think, is a little bit extreme and does often come with consequences from that. So trying to educate the person on what they might be missing out on if they do go down that approach. I think one of the craziest ones is potentially just fully cutting out fruit. So in an attempt to cut out sugar, they cut out fruit, which is a very natural and nutritious food product. So they're probably some of the main ones, I guess, that I think people would be a little less extreme about.
So a bad food really doesn't necessarily, whatever that means, need to be culled out because there are consequences. Are there any other foods like that? I guess it's a big topic, but the carbohydrates would be another one, I guess, that might fit in there, or dairy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every individual has specific needs, specific upbringings or outlook. So I'm never going to necessarily judge a person or tell them no, that that's wrong. But it's really just figuring out what their beliefs are, and then making sure that if that is what they want to do, then we're educating them on the possible health challenges and trying to let them do it in the healthiest way possible. For example, with not cutting out dairy. Well, okay, let's think about bone health. Let's think about calcium. It's a good source of protein. What are other options there? So just working with them to make sure all the good boxes are ticked.
Yeah, great. And any other myths? Good and bad foods. Looking for long-standing changes. I think that I've heard you say, progress over perfection. Is there any other myths?
I guess supplements is a big one. So sort of thermogenics or fat burners. That's sort of one where I'm like, maybe it's a tiny percent at the very end, but there are so many more things that we need to work on. So the way I describe it, fat burners are like trying to empty a pool with a teaspoon. And if you haven't got your diet right, it's essentially raining at the same time. So there are certainly other ways to invest in your money.
I'm just picturing that. There's been quite a bit of rain around lately, and the pool can fill up quite quickly. So being out there with a teaspoon wouldn't be a lot of fun.
No, exactly.
So don't get suckered into some of the hype, I guess, around the magic pill.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. All right, Andrew, let's talk all things. This show's the Physical Performance Show. The theme is to help listeners of the show perform at their physical best. So you've got a lot to offer in this space, performance nutrition. I propose we start with endurance sports. What do we need to know to fuel ourselves well for endurance sports, be that triathlon, trail running, road racing, road running, swimming, whatever it might be?
Yeah, okay. It's obviously a pretty big question, but I do want to sort of start big and work in from there.
Great.
I guess some of the signs to look for if your nutrition isn't meeting your demands of your sport would be constant tiredness, repeatedly getting sick, repeated niggles or injuries, not seeing any sort of progress in times or splits or strengths. So there's some of the things to keep an eye out for. When someone comes to me to chat around, trail running and just wanting to make sure that they're eating better, the first thing we want to do is just make sure that the amount of energy that they're getting from their food and drink is enough to sustain them. Because if it's not, then that's going to be a very big challenge, and also a big challenge for their health. Because if there's limited energy coming in and they're burning the energy, with that exercise, then there are some other things like immune health or menstrual cycle for females or those sorts of things that are affected by that.
So the first step is to figure out, is there enough calories or fuel coming in to sustain the activities?
Absolutely.
And just practically, and it might be beyond the scope of a conversation, I appreciate that, but how do you do that? What do you use to figure out if there's a balance there that's correct?
Well, I will go into great detail with the athlete around what they're eating across a typical day or 3 days, for example, and use software to make sure that ticks all the boxes. I would use objective data, such as, depending on the athlete and with their permission, collect weight or skim folds or waist measurements to see if their body is changing. And then also subjective questions like, are you sleeping well? What are your energy levels? How hungry are you, etc. So if they're always fatigued, they're losing weight unintentionally, and they're always sore, then there's a good sign that they're not meeting their demands.
Yeah, okay, that's great, and I guess that throws off with the current terminology, around REDS, which. Can you speak to that concept, if possible?
Yeah, so that concept is in regards to, quite often it's endurance athletes, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, in which an individual isn't getting the right amount of energy from the foods and drinks for what they're trying to achieve from a physical point of view in exercise, but also just their daily physiological requirements, whether that be growing hair, growing bone, reproductive hormone production, etc. So sometimes it might be because they're very aggressive and trying to get down to a certain race weight, or cyclists trying to get up hills at a lot of weight, it would be one. But other times it can be completely unintentional, where their training volume has increased so much but they haven't necessarily made that adjustment. So there are a number of ways it can come about, but obviously that's an important part of our screening tool within that first session, is just to make sure or flag any chances that might be a risk.
And I do a lot of work in the endurance sports space as a physiotherapist, and I don't have the skill set that obviously someone like yourself or one of your colleagues would have, Andrew, but it's something that I'm really quite aware of, just in terms of the big impact that this can have on a physiotherapist's aim to try and help their musculoskeletal system. But if that energy is just not available, then you're arguably fighting a losing battle until that's corrected. So, and just to clarify, REDS, it stands for Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport, and it's certainly become a lot more topical in the more recent years in the sports medicine literature.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, depending on the way in which it's come about, someone might be trying or pushing the boundaries there to improve their performance, when really, if they're underdoing it, then their performance is only going to suffer. So, yeah, chatting to a sports dietitian or professional to get that peace of mind and that education can be very, very valuable.
And I mean, in endurance sports, weight is the enemy of speed, and so there's that tension of wanting to be lean and light, and performing versus undernourished and possibly detrimenting their performance. And I think it's just a tension that has to be managed. I don't know if it's a problem that ever really gets solved. It's a constant pursuit. Is that a fair assessment?
The constant chasing of that perfect sweet spot is that what you mean?
Yeah, like it's it's a bit like, is it enough training? Is it not enough training? I guess, or can you definitively say, look, you're not meeting your requirements, because training loads are forever changing. People's absorption of the training is forever changing. So is it something that just needs some regular or intermittent check-in for endurance athletes from someone like yourself to really try and hit the sweet spot?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There are guidelines around the sort of criteria for someone falling into that category, and that is the amount of energy per kilogram of body weight. So if they're that's one of the ways in which I guess it can be diagnosed. So when collecting that data, that's one of the factors. But I think I guess, and we might get to it a little bit down the track, but really being specific with the way in which we use food or don't use food within our training can improve performance, but we might chat about that.
Well, let's definitely do that. So how we use food in training and for performance. So you've established if someone's meeting energy requirements for performance, what's next?
So the next thing that I would generally chat around is the whole macronutrient. So that's, your fats, your carbs and your protein. And alcohol, depending on the individual. So just making sure that we're getting the right amount of those. For most athletes, you're looking at around 1 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Around 1.6 is probably a good place to start for most endurance athletes. And that's where we start. And then generally the carbohydrates are going to be, I call it a sliding scale. So on the days that they're doing more or double sessions, their body essentially needs more of those carbohydrates to help recover between them. And the days that it might be a rest day or a quieter or lighter day, then they use or eat less carbohydrates. And then you've obviously got those dietary fats, making sure that those, as much as possible, they're sort of unsaturated, coming from whole foods or quality foods like, salmon or walnuts, avocado, olives, extra virgin olive oil, that sort of thing. So that would be the second phase. Just touching on the alcohol quickly. Again, big picture stuff. There's a lot that an individual does, and social health is important. But from a recovery point of view, it's not the best tool to use. I.e., it's not going to help in that phase if you're serious about your performance.
And to practically unpack that a little, what effect does alcohol have on recovery? So you've just done completed a hard event. You want to let your hair down, but in doing that, you do have another race or a meaningful training session to get done in the coming days. So what effect does alcohol actually have, Andrew?
I think, it's important to, celebrate those small achievements. So if there's a race that's being done, what I'll often say to my clients or the people that I work with is that let's make sure that you've had at least one good recovery meal immediately after, if not 2, and then, celebrate. So, that's where I generally would go with a post-race situation. But for the people that are training sort of 7 to 14, 15 sessions a week, alcohol really, and if it's of a night time, it's bringing in extra calories, which the body can't really use. It's typically going to create inflammation. It's going to shallow out the sleep, which is probably one of the biggest challenges. So the sleep quality isn't as good, and we're seeing more and more how influential sleep is on athletic performance. And then sometimes it can be, well, what comes along with the alcohol. So the snacking, the cheese, the chips, or the next day. If it's been a big one, people often eat differently the next day. So yeah, they're the main sort of influences I see with alcohol.
Yeah, no, certainly. And as you say, social health is important. So it's always, contextual.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, got it. So, okay. So we've, you've spoken about macronutrients, fats, carbohydrates, proteins. So what's next? You've established energy availability. What's next in terms of optimizing performance, say for an endurance athlete?
So it really comes down to that nutrient timing. So when are we having those particular macronutrients? So typically during the day, I would start by sort of anchoring 3 main protein meals. Now, we know that from a muscle recovery, muscle building perspective, around that 20 to 25 grams of protein per meal is a very good place to start, because there's a certain amount that the body needs at that time to sort of recognize that it can go and use that protein on building muscle. So, for example, 100 grams of cooked chicken would get you 20 to 25 grams, or some eggs on toast with a milky coffee at breakfast would get you pretty close to 20 to 25 grams as well. So we want to make sure that they're typically there at the 3 main meals, and then after any sort of exercise session as well. What I try and do is often use a stereotypical meal, so a breakfast or a dinner, and using real food after a session. So if you go, get home from work, go for a run, come home, then that would be your recovery meal. And then we might try and either, a snack during the day where it's a sort of a high-quality protein as well. So that might be some tuna on corn thins or cottage cheese on some multigrain bread or something like that. So that's protein. And then the carbohydrates is a very, very well discussed and very, I guess, topical thing that's going on at the moment. So depending what we call nutrition periodization. Sometimes actually not having any carbs during some sessions will help with the body adapting differently. Sometimes if it's a very, very intense training session, if it's a very technical one, then I would suggest typically have some carbohydrates before those occurrences, simply because we want the brain to be switched on, and we want muscle glycogen stores to be filled up. So if you're going hard out, or if you're trying to listen to your coach and you haven't fueled properly, then you're probably not going to get the most out of those sessions.
So I was going to ask what you meant by technical sessions. So, you'd be referring to a session where you're taking instructions, say like at the Brisbane Broncos from the coach, and you're trying to physically output as well as mentally process.
Gymnasts trying to learn new routines, or, running. So it's quite often probably with team sports where, basketball players have to learn certain set plays. So if they're underdone with nutrition and they might not be thinking as clearly, they might not have as much concentration, they might be thinking about how hungry they are. So you certainly, if you're going to sort of train low, so which is a phrase that you would use when there's not a lot of carbohydrates available to the body, you don't necessarily want to train low on super significant or super intense sessions for those reasons.
Okay, so that's a good delineation. Training, there's times when you just don't want to really go there, otherwise your performance or ability to output might suffer. So what else on the carbohydrate nutrient intake is important?
So fibre is a very common, I guess carbohydrates are a really, really good source of fibre. So you think about oats or sweet potato, heavy seeded bread that when you pick it up, it's really, really heavy, fibre in fruit, etc. That's going to help people feel full for longer. It's going to help with the digestive health. It's going to help with their gut health. And I'm sure yourself, all the listeners have seen all the headlines around the importance of gut health and the implications on mood or, just general well-being. So that's one of the benefits of having carbohydrates in the diet.
Yeah, got it. Even this morning, I had an endurance-based runner in, and he's had some very successful health transformations around going really low carb with his diet, and he's been trying, I guess, in his words, fat adapt with his endurance running. So, and I mentioned that we were recording this evening. And he said, please ask around where everything's up to with this seemingly endless debate about, carbohydrates versus no carbohydrates, low carb, high fat for endurance sports. And my not fully informed view would be that perhaps there's not binary. One's not good, one's not bad. My understanding would be that there's a place for both. So what's the easiest way to summarise your view on this debate, if you like, for endurance sports?
The answer I would say is that we now sort of work on substrate flexibility. So by using certain feeding practices, manipulating when carbs are there, when fat is there, etc., we build the athlete the tools within the cells to be able to use both. Now, if someone is always low carb and they're training at a very low intensity for a very long time, so you're talking, ultra endurance or whatever, that might be a reasonable thing to do. But as soon as they if they're, trail running and try and run up a hill or trying to catch up to someone or have to do an effort, then that shifts into a higher intensity, and that's typically where the body likes to use glucose or carbohydrates to fuel that high-intensity exercise. Now, if the individual hasn't used or practiced training with carbohydrates, then the body doesn't have the systems in place to do that well. So what we want to try and do is allow the individual to do both. So the analogy that I like to use is kind of comparing an Android to an Apple product, for example. So if you're doing slow work on your Android all the time, but then someone says, quick, I need you to do this work quickly with his Apple phone. If you haven't used an Apple phone before, you're going to be very inefficient at doing that particular work, right? So you want to try and teach yourself to use both. So when the time comes, you've got, I guess, the adaptations to do both. And that's things like enzymes and teaching the mitochondria within the cell to burn fat when it's in a low state, etc.
Okay, so that's a really nice analogy. I think everyone can picture that if they're still not stuck in the pool trying to get the water level down with the teaspoon. So no, I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. It makes sense to me. So you're, I guess, as a sports dietitian, you're going to assess their unique needs, the demands of their sport, and recommend and build out a plan from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we would find those sort of key moments within a training block or within a week where we're like, okay, let's do a really intense session of a night time, have some protein, but keep it low carb, then get up the next day, not eat beforehand and do a session. So that's what you would call train low. And then that kind of helps the body with some different mitochondrial adaptations or cellular adaptations that are better in that circumstance that might not have occurred if you had carbohydrates. On the other side of the coin, really, really intense work all the time without having carbohydrates can influence gut health, might influence immune health, etc. So that's why we're specific around the kind of sessions that we use.
So if you've got a triathlete or a swimmer who's hitting the pool at 5 or 5:30 a.m., going to do a good 1.5, 2 hour session in the morning, or that might be a runner, is it fair, from what I've just heard, that there might be occasions where you want them to train low and maybe not ingest anything or restrict different foods before they train? Or would that vary, or would that just be a blanket that, hey, triathlete or runner, just don't have anything when you wake up, go and get the session done? How does that sort of work early in the morning?
Yeah, so there's definitely no blanket statements. It's very, individual specific, goal specific. Again, if someone's getting up and it's a fairly intense session in the morning, then we do want to make sure that they've had some fuel coming on board. You know, studies have recently shown that we have these certain receptors in our oral cavity or in our mouth that sense carbohydrates, and that tells the brain, hey, we've got some fuel coming on here, we can go a little bit harder. So it's an actual central nervous system chat, I guess. And, you know, I saw an example of this in one of the Tour de France stage races where one of the cyclists was riding towards the end and he's ripped out a gel, put it in his mouth, but that gel doesn't actually have enough time to be digested and get into his blood, so it's effectively useless. But what he's doing is using that whole oral sensing mechanism to help just with a little boost there as well.
You're listening to Andrew Hall, Sports Dietitian and Exercise Scientist, on this expert edition of the Physical Performance Show, sharing around all things performance nutrition concepts and injury management through nutrition. Support for today's show comes from the Gold Coast Marathon. Just like the Physical Performance Show, the Gold Coast Marathon encourages runners of all ages and abilities to push their boundaries and strive to complete a personal challenge. The Gold Coast Marathon is held annually on the first weekend in July and is a must-do event for any budding athlete, weekend warrior, or family looking for a challenge to complete together. Run for the good times at the Gold Coast Marathon. Visit goldcoastmarathon.com.au. I caught up recently with race director of the Gold Coast Marathon, Cam Hart, who shared around an ongoing and attention-grabbing rivalry that exists between two of the great Gold Coast Marathon winners, Yuki Kawaguchi and also Kenneth Mangara.
Kenneth Mangara from Kenya, the running barber, 44 years of age. He's still winning the event. He's still performing at a very high level. but the competitiveness he has with his global favourite and the Boston Marathon winner Yuki Kawauchi is awesome to see every year. Look, both have a wonderful respect for each other, but they're both very serious competitors, and what we have created each year, and that rivalry and camaraderie amongst two of the world's favourite athletes is something that the team in the Gold Coast Marathon are very proud of.
Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. We do not want to see you for a single session more than what you need, nor do we want to see you for a single session less than what you need. We just want to make sure you get back to your physical best. To find out more about Pogo Physio's services, including our fixed fee monthly wellness booster packs, or to schedule your 1 hour initial appointment, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back with Andrew Hall, Sports Dietitian and Exercise Scientist, on this, an expert edition of the Physical Performance Show. Andrew, we've spoken about energy availability, macronutrients, nutrient timing, and I guess some thoughts would be, eating for recovery and also fueling for race day. You happy to go there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the other big one to me is food quality. So when we talk about carbs or proteins, there's obviously a range of ways in which that can be consumed. So we typically want to go with nutrient-rich carbohydrates. So they're the ones that are going to have the different types of prebiotics in them for our gut health, the vitamins and minerals that come with, fruits and vegetables, etc., the antioxidants in those foods. If we're having sort of highly processed and nutrient-poor food, then that would suggest that recovery isn't going to be there as well. So going through the importance or the spectrum, you want to try and get whole foods that are the least amount of processing to them more often to give your body the best chance to recover. And we find that food is magical in a way where supplementing with certain vitamins and minerals doesn't have the same effect as eating those vitamins within the whole food as well.
So, apples aren't apples, I guess. Pardon the pun.
You could say that.
Sorry, a terrible pun there. Got it. So, food quality is something to be aware of as well. So, recovery, fueling for recovery. You did touch on the key of the timing of ingestion. So, someone's just completed a rigorous, high perception of effort training session, maybe some time trials of some kind. Once again, I know there's no blankets, but could you best guide us around what we then go and do? Do we reach for some fluid protein shake? Do we go for, as you've referenced there before, a meal of some kind? Yeah,
so I guess there's a couple of different options, but typically you want to rehydrate. So if there's a lot of fluid that's been lost, around the country this summer, obviously very hot. So you want to make sure that you've replaced all the fluids that you've lost. If you're drinking water with a meal that you're eating, there's going to be natural electrolytes in there, so that should do the job. If you've got a bit of time, so I guess to caveat would be, if you've got a bit of, the amount of time you have in between your training sessions might depend on what you eat. But if, let's say, it's a night session and you don't have to train until the next evening, then you've got a bit of time up your sleeve. And simply having a meal that contains high-quality protein, so that would be things like dairy foods, some chicken, some seafood, some salmon, that sort of thing, to get that 25 grams at least. The carbohydrates there to replenish your stores that you've used, your muscle glycogen stores. So that could be let's say a chicken stir fry or a salmon and Asian greens and brown rice. And then I guess the third part of that whole equation is getting some colour on your plate. And that's one of the most common things I have to work with of people on how we're going to get that happening, because we know from the statistics that only sort of 5% of all Australians are getting their 2 fruit, 5 veg. So the colour on your plate, and that's in reference to the vegetables and the salad, is a big component of recovering well because they have those natural antioxidants which are going to help with reducing muscle soreness.
That's staggering. 5% of Australians are getting 2 fruits and 5 veg.
Yeah, consistency on average. So the last time I read those statistics, that's where things were sitting.
Wow.
So you have to be very, very abnormal to eat well or to eat healthily, if that makes sense.
Gosh, that's stunning. And Andrew, anything else on recovery? I don't know if it's a good time now just to explore a little bit about where things are up to with the rehydration, topic, which is, as long as I've been in sports medicine, seems to be a sometimes more intense discussion around it, but it seems to be it's never really gone away. Can you maybe just share a little bit around what the latest findings and evidence points to with regards to rehydrating after strenuous activity?
So I guess the rehydrating component is generally what you would ideally is replace about 150% of sweat losses during that exercise. So an example of that would be if you go for an hour run and you lose a kilogram because you've weighed yourself before and after, then you want to drink 1.5 litres of fluid within the next sort of 2 to 3 hours, just to make sure that you've gotten your body back into the positive or euhydration, so adequate hydration. Generally, I just like to say drink to thirst. I say check your weight. So is that consistent? Are there big fluctuations in the morning? Check your urine colour. So you don't want it to be completely clear because you may have gone too far, but you also don't want it to be too dark or too yellow. So I would say aim for lemonade or like a solo colour, and then thirst as well. So if most people are doing that, they're going to be doing pretty well. The challenge arises when the whole drink to thirst concept is that not everyone has that available. So if you're going out for a period of time, if you're playing a sport where you don't have access to fluids immediately when you're thirsty, then that's where the challenge arises. So that's why sports dietitians would work with those particular individuals to come up with the best plan for them. I don't know if I really answered the question that well then, but hopefully that kind of makes sense.
No, you gave some great tips there. Replace 150% of the sweat loss.
Yeah, in the sort of 2 to 3 hours following
that. In
a
2 to 3 hour window. Yeah, absolutely. And does it matter if that's just golloped down in one quick, mass, tipping back of the head and popping it down, or should that be titrated out over that time?
Yeah, great question. If you've got time on your hands, I would say 150 to 200 mils every 15 minutes or so. So just sipping on it. As I mentioned, that when you're drinking those sort of that water with a meal afterwards, then the electrolytes in that food help your body absorb it as well. We know that dairy foods are a really great rehydration tool. So if you're training late of a night time, you get home, it's quite late, and you've got to get up and train again in the morning, then that's when something like a smoothie or yogurt and sliced fruit, etc., would be a really good option because of the rehydration properties that dairy products have, and obviously wanting to be able to have it quite quickly and get to bed to get up and do it all again as the world of a triathlete.
Absolutely. So some great tips there in terms of recovery strategies. Protein shakes, are they a valid form alongside the chicken, for example, that you mentioned?
They have their time and place. I'm always going to promote real food as often as possible. I guess they're there for convenience sake. I would use it with people, let's say, if they've driven out to a certain cycling group or run group and it's a 45-minute drive home, and they haven't got their food ready when they get home. So there could be, a good 90 to 2 hours, then I might say to that individual, look, why don't you pop some protein in a shaker, add some water to it when you're done with your session. That'll get you through. And then when there's not as much stress or you're not as hangry, or by the time when you get home, then you've ticked those recovery boxes and you're not going to snack on all sorts of stuff while you're waiting for the food to arise. I guess the other, it's there for a convenience thing. So, I work with people that do all sorts of jobs, whether it be tradies or not everyone's in a 9 to 5. Lots of people are driving. So at the right place and at the right time, I think that context, I guess.
Yeah, right. And I was interested, you just used a word that I didn't know was a real diagnosis, but perhaps it is, and that's hangry.
Yeah. It's all over the internet memes, isn't it? But it's a real thing. I suffer from it from myself sometimes.
Yeah, as do I. If you missed last week's episode of the Physical Performance Show featuring Australian swim team member, World, Commonwealth and Olympic medalist Taylor McEwen, here's a little snippet of what you missed.
I've just always found fun in being competitive. I think it's that natural drive within me that really pushes me in training. I love racing my training partners and I love trying to get the best out of myself, and I'm not afraid of the pain. So I will go until I physically can't leave the pool, until the lactate has left my body. I will push myself until I nearly pass out at the end of sessions, but looking back, it just builds me into a better athlete, I think, both physically and mentally, because you have to be mentally tough to be able to push yourself physically.
To tune into the full episode and explore the archives of the Physical Performance Show, jump over to your favourite podcast player or to pogophysio.com.au and peruse away, dating right back to episode 1 featuring Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with Andrew Hall on this expert edition, sports dietitian and exercise scientist on all things nutrition for performance and nutrition for injury management. Andrew, thank you. Race day, so much here. I know this is a big topic, but just if there's any practical tips, I mean, we wake up, we've got a marathon to run at 7:20 a.m. What do we need to do? How do we best approach it before we get to the start line? And then, how do we navigate, say, a 3 to 5 hour marathon run in terms of ingesting gels or otherwise?
All right, yeah, great question. Number one rule for sports nutrition when it comes to race day is don't try anything new on race day. So whatever you're doing, you want to make sure that you've done it before, you feel comfortable, the foods work for you. And I really like that. I really love working with people in this space because, races can be quite nerve-wracking. And the last thing we want people doing is being nervous around their food, questioning whether or not it's going to meet their needs. Will it work for me this time? Am I going to bonk again? So working with an individual before they get to that point is one of the biggest things that we do, I would say. Let's say early morning run or triathlon, you want to get up, and I would generally try and have a bigger meal sort of 2 to 3 hours before, something that is higher in carbohydrates, lower in fat, lower in fibre, just because they're not useful nutrients at that point in time, and we don't want a lot of residual fibre in the digestive tract during that next few hours. Then what you want to do is obviously make sure that your hydration, so sipping on water or a sports drink, depending on the individual, in the lead up to that race. And then once the gun goes off, then it depends on the amount of time that race is going for. If the particular event is sub 3 hours, then you generally want to be aiming for between 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. If the race is going 3 hours plus, then that's when I would get people to try and train their guts to be to digest 60 to 75 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So it really depends on the duration. And as you sort of heard me mention, you want to make sure that you've trained your body to be able to exercise at an intensity and consume that certain amount of carbohydrates or fuel. Because it's not as simply as I don't like to eat gels, I won't train on them, and then all of a sudden on race day just change it and grab the free gels that are on the side of the race and expect it to be okay.
Okay, so we ideally would be implementing this into our training.
Absolutely, you want a few trial runs from a nutrition point of view, so you've got that confidence and you know that the product works for you, the amount and the timing works for you as well.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And in terms of ingesting a gel, for example, say during a marathon, is there any merit in the information around just gently sort of sipping it, so to speak, over a period of time versus one big gollop of the contents of the gel?
Look, it's not something that I've seen a lot of science on that particular aspect. So if you're talking about sports gels in particular, or the carbohydrate gels, generally I would get those people to sort of get it out of their pocket ready as they're entering an aid station, consume the gel reasonably quickly, and then pick up some water and drink that, or pick up some fluid and drink that to help get that down into the gut and get the digestion going.
Okay, so no, that's great. Race day, you get through the event, and then obviously then your event's completed. That then feeds into the recovery strategies that you just shared a moment ago.
Yeah, you cross the line with another PB would be ideal.
Yep, and not a pain in the stomach.
Exactly. No unexpected toilet stops. No bonking. We definitely don't want that stuff happening.
I think most people have been there, and it's and on that bonking, I'm sure most people have experienced it. But what actually is it? What happens?
Essentially, it's your body has run out of or crossed a threshold in which it can't keep up with the amount of effort you're trying to put in. So you may have run out of muscle glycogen. It's typically in those longer sessions where people aren't keeping up the amount of carbohydrate that they need, so their body goes into their reserves or the muscle glycogen in their body, and once that's depleted, then it starts to get a little bit not so nice, and because of the intensity that they're trying to achieve, that's when the body has to use or change what it's burning, and that's kind of when it forces you to slow down, really slow down.
Yeah, and if you've experienced it, and it's a, you know, I can recall when I've had it, I get like tremors, you start to go quite lightheaded, obviously, and anytime I've had that happen, I tend to reflexively just grab anything I can food-wise, which, it might be packets of snakes or just anything. It's almost like there's no screening there of any choices. It's just, I just need something. Is there anything specifically or that you'd advise around, if you do bonk, the best way to get out of it, not just for performance because your day's done, but really in terms of getting your best out of yourself, but how do you for your health's sake best navigate a bonk?
Well, I guess you just want to obviously sort of take it easy and take it at a pace that you feel comfortable. I still wouldn't, as much as you'd want to just guzzle a litre of Coke or throw a bag of snakes lollies down, you still would want to be fairly slow in your approach. It's actually not a question that I get asked all that much, because most of the people chatting to me don't get to that point. But I would say you would start with 30 grams of carbs and then wait at least sort of 15 minutes before you sort of did the same sort of thing, if that makes sense. So when I say 30 grams of carbs, that could be 5 lollies or 1 gel or 400 mils of sports drink or 1 sports bar. They're generally around that sort of 30 grams of carbs. So have that, then wait sort of 5 to 10 minutes and see how you feel.
Okay, no, look, that's great. I ask selfishly because I have sat at a fast food shop and just about eaten everything, trying to get myself home. So clearly, did it work? It did. After maybe about an hour, I felt okay, but clearly I needed to have consulted you beforehand, Andrew, and it wouldn't have happened in the first place. Going back quite a few years, mind you. But Andrew, performance nutrition concepts are enormous. So thank you for taking us there. In brief, I mean, there's a lot you could expand here with your knowledge on injury management, nutrition. But if we can, you've touched on tendons. We touched on energy availability. And I guess an area that, if possible, to just briefly explore would be bone stress injury. Injuries to the bones, so common in runners and impact loading sports. So what's important to know from a dietetic point of view around maximising our recovery from these sorts of injuries? Yeah,
so ideally, I guess from a preventative point of view, those bone stress injuries, we want to make sure that we've got the energy availability there again, so just making sure that we're meeting our needs. And then some of the key sort of factors that the research suggests are around those sort of calcium and dairy products, vitamin D, for any sort of indoor sports or certain sports, and just a general sort of not a lot of amount of natural sunlight due to sunscreen and all that sort of stuff, and then just the quality. So there's sort of an inverse relationship between higher fruits and vegetable intakes have been associated with higher bone mineral density and less bone mineral density loss over time. So I guess the vitamins, minerals, antioxidants that are in those foods that help give yourself the best chance with that repeated bone stress that goes on with within running or endurance exercise.
Okay, great. And anything else on bone stress injuries?
No, look, I think, there was an interesting study done a few years ago where they looked at female distance runners who were aged between sort of 18 and 26 years of age. And they basically chatted and just spoke to those people and did asked them about their diet. And they kind of found that those who were consuming 800 milligrams of calcium daily had a 6-fold increased risk for stress fractures compared to those who were consuming 1,500 milligrams of calcium per day.
Yeah, wow, that's extraordinary. 600% greater risk.
Yeah, so that, those types of studies do have their limitations, but essentially what we want to make sure is that people in that category are at least getting 1,300 milligrams of calcium a day, if not a little bit more, just to make sure that they're meeting their needs. And there is a bit of research that I won't go into in a great deal today, but around maybe having some calcium before going out for those bigger sort of intense sessions. And I think that, the Australian cricket team are very aware of that because bone stress injuries in their fast bowlers is a big concern as well.
That's so interesting, Andrew. With the work I do with the Super League Triathlon Series, one of the prominent athletes there actually shared recently that something that their national body's suggesting their health centre is to dose up on calcium before super intense sessions. So there really could be something in that.
Yeah, and that's the thing around sports nutrition research is that it's constantly, it's still fairly young and it's constantly changing. So, we do need to be careful about the way that we absorb that research, but we're obviously trying to fully understand all these mechanisms to the best of our ability, and that's one that is sort of come to the forefront of late.
So interesting, and I guess chasing gold medals, then everything, anything that can be done that's legal, of course, is what's been explored. Andrew, immobilisation injuries, this pertains to someone in a moon boot for, say, an ankle fracture, right through to a cast of some kind. I believe there are things that can be potentially done through diet and nutrition that can help with that process. Can you share around those?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we want to try and do is preserve muscle mass. We want to do that simply because, it's for anyone who's been to the gym for a number of years, and it's bloody hard to grow muscle. So we certainly want to make sure that we don't lose any more than we need to. And it does happen quite quickly. So, for example, if someone was playing rugby on the weekend and they've had a bad knee injury and they've had to go into surgery or into a cast, that we know that when that is immobilised, that the healthy tissue starts to decrease pretty quickly, and that up to 150 to 400 milligrams of muscle tissue can be lost within the first 1 to 2 weeks. Obviously depending on the individual, but it does decline pretty quickly. So from a nutrition point of view, what we want to do is swoop in or even educate players before it happens. So when it does, we can jump in. So the things that are of most importance is the protein timing, and the protein amount becomes even more important. And what they found is that the doses actually need to jump up a little bit for people because the muscle doesn't have the same receptiveness to the normal amount. So that's one of the things that we can do. We also get people to sort of take creatine, so 10 grams a day for the first 2 to 3 weeks, and then dropping back after that. And that has been shown to sort of help preserve some of or reducing that muscle loss. And then not in the acute phase, but soon thereafter, getting on some fish oil as well, because that can help with the anabolic or the muscle building capacity of the muscle cells. So they're the three main things that we sort of look at from preserving muscle. Obviously, obviously to me, the total amount of calories and making sure that that's meeting the demands is important as well, because healing tissue does actually take a fair bit of energy for the body to do. So I think some people, depending on the sport, if they get injured, they're concerned of their body weight going up because they can't use their leg. But what we don't want to do is underdo it and then impact the healing of that particular injury.
And it's not something that you really think of, is it? You just away you go in the boot, and unless it's someone like yourself educating. So that's absolutely terrific, and a real eye opener for myself as a practitioner as well. So thanks for taking us there. And just finally, concussion. This has certainly been a topic of great focus in the sports medicine community for some time, but what role does nutrition play in concussion?
Well, I'd say it's, the nutrition is still, the research on this space is still developing. From my understanding of where things sit at the moment, essentially it can be used as a preemptive strategy. So for people in sports where concussion is likely, whether that be martial arts, your different types of football, contact sports, then having some creatine on a daily basis can be a good idea, but also if there is a concussion that occurs, supplementing soon thereafter. And from my understanding is that, the brain does use creatine typically, and that they've shown during those mild traumatic brain injuries that the use goes up. So if we're supplementing from a dietary point of view, then that helps meet those needs, and there are potentially some more positive or better outcomes in that space.
So post-concussion, if anyone's had the misfortune of being concussed, then don't just think about the cognition, but also consider the role that nutrition might be playing in your recovery, and consult someone like yourself, Andrew, a sports dietitian, for some possible input there.
Yep.
Andrew, this is a huge topic, and you've been very generous with your time and knowledge. Finally, a couple of final questions. One, almost impossible to answer, but I'll throw it to you anyway. If Andrew Hall, sports dietitian, exercise scientist, could boil everything that you've learnt down to one piece of advice for listeners of this show to help them perform at their physical best, what's Andrew Hall's one piece of advice going to be?
I believe that the people that I see do best prioritise planning and preparation of their nutrition. So to me, the individuals who sit down, think about where they're going to be during the week from a work perspective or a training perspective, and plan out what foods they can eat and what's going to be available, and then prepare as much of that as possible, that's going to have the biggest impact, because it's what we do day in, day out. So the gels during the race don't have nearly as much of an impact as what we do on a daily basis, and I think that dedicating a small amount of time, whether that's 15 minutes a week or 30 minutes a week, to sit down, plan and prepare, will have a huge impact on your ability as an athlete and the quality of food and your health in general.
And to say planning, when you mention that, do you mean like diarising out that, or do you mean just planning meals, or how does planning look for an athlete for nutrition?
So I guess it would be what planning is in what am I going to have for breakfast this week? Is it going to be yogurt muesli? Is it going to be smoked salmon bagels? Is it going to be eggs on toast? So just thinking about that, people travel or work in different situations. So you just want to, I think, have an idea of where you're going to be during the week, and then come up with a food strategy of, okay, well, I'm traveling that day, so I can't, and I don't have a microwave, so I've got to, I might have to have a cold meal, and I have to keep it in my car. So that's kind of the stuff that I'm talking about as well.
Andrew, physical challenge for the week. Every featured guest gets to issue listeners with a physical challenge. What is Andrew Hall's physical challenge of the week going to be for listeners?
So I think something that would benefit most people would be to challenge themselves not to be looking at a screen, whether that be their phone or a computer screen or a TV screen, whilst they eat for a whole week. Now, the reason I say that is because I think that we're very busy and preoccupied, and we're maybe not focusing on all the flavours that we're getting, the textures from the food that we're eating, and we might actually enjoy it more, and maybe or eat less of it or whatever. But just noticing that there's much more chance of noticing these signals and cues if we're not preoccupied with a screen. And I think it's a big challenge in society at the moment.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful. So drop screen time for a week, see how you go while you eat. I'll try and take that on as well.
It's much easier said than done.
Yeah, I mean, we have screens behind our eyelids these days, don't we?
Yeah.
No, look, that's fantastic. Andrew, if listeners want to find out more about your services as a sports dietitian, where can they go? What's the best way to stay in touch with you and all that you're doing?
Okay, so I guess my Instagram handle is Andrew Hall Dietitian, and there's an underscore between those words there. My Twitter handle is Andrew Hall 1310, and just in the process of creating a website, which will be andrewhalldietitian.com.au. So that's where I would start. And
we can reach out to you there with any questions and start a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, still working in the clinic. We do online consultations as well. So for any listeners out there that sort of heard something that affected them or interested them, then please do reach out.
Absolutely fantastic. And the world of online telehealth, so much can be done. It's certainly not an inferior option.
Yeah, it's one of the pros, definitely. It's being able to reach people that can't make it. So I'm glad that we have that tool.
No, absolutely. Andrew Hall, thank you very much for your time. After hours as we record this, you've got a big week ahead with the kickoff of the NRL season, the Broncos, and of course your work with the Bullets. So thank you once again for sharing your knowledge.
My pleasure, Brad. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust you enjoyed today's episode featuring Andrew Hall. If you did, then please let Andrew and myself know what it was that you took away from the show. Andrew is easily found over on Instagram at Andrew_Hall_dietitian. I'm found over at Brad_beer, and let us know what it was that you learnt through Andrew's sharings. If you know someone that would benefit from Andrew's sharings, then please share away, share the link, or direct them to the episode. That would be enormously appreciated. You can find the Physical Performance Show over on Instagram at Physical Performance Show, and there you can post up your podsies. That's simply a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying and tagging the show or myself in. A massive thanks to those who have been subscribing to the Physical Performance Show. That really is the best way to help this show grow and reach more people. And a massive thanks to those who have been leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes. In particular this week, a big shout out to Tavian Emanuel. Tavian rated the Physical Performance Show 5 stars and commented, "Long drives are no longer an issue. Being from the UK, I never thought I'd say that because we don't drive very far." This podcast has honestly been my bread and butter for the last year. Whether Brad is diving into the science or the minds of the featured athletes, it's a worthwhile listen, so plug in your headphones and start listening. I now have my mum tuning in every week all the way from Wales. We love it. Tavian, thank you very much for taking the time to leave a review. And what's fun to note is that since being introduced to the show, you now have found a home here at Pogo Physio. So thank you for that review. And of course, we'll get a copy of my running bestseller, You Can Run Pain Free, the revised and expanded edition, in your hands directly. Massive thanks to the 3 great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. Coming up next week on the Physical Performance Show, we keep the Expert Edition theme running, and I bring you a conversation that I recently had with Dr. Christian Morrow of Bond University. Dr. Morrow is an Associate Professor of Medicine and Biomedical Science at Bond University. He's the Medical Program Theme Lead, Lecturer, Laboratory Researcher, App Developer, Of note, Dr. Christian recently was awarded the Australian Award for Teaching Excellence. That's right, of all universities, Dr. Morrow was singled out for his incredible work in teaching students around all things medical science. And we'll have a fun chat around the science of all things physiology and muscles. So be sure to tune in next week for Dr. Christian Morrow. He's quite a character. You're not going to want to miss his teachings. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.